It is 12:30 on the East Coast, 11:30 in the Central region. I'm not going to go on with the rest of the country. You know what time it is. It's time for Litvak Leadership Live, episode 177, Your Path Through Thoughtful Response and Implementation of Feedback. I've got a tremendous guest today, Robert Bruce Adolph, a retired military strategist, retired with all sorts of military accolades. But before I bring him on, I want to ask you, are you aware that my book, Proverbs for Leadership, is going to be available on January 10th? If you have not signed up for notifications about the book, please head over to proverbsforleadership.com, where you can find out more about the book. You can sign up for my newsletter where you get inside track information about the book, some of the history behind some of the accounts and stories within the book, and general motivation. It is my pleasure today to bring on my guest, Robert Bruce Adolph. I do not have his biography in front of me, and for some reason, it's not letting me bring him in. There we go. There you are. Hello, Bob. How are you?
Hi, Sean. Good afternoon.
Good to see you today. So, Bob himself is also, and is very, very distinguished. You can go to his website, robertbruceadolph.com, read all about him, his personal experiences. He's also written a book that's been out. He's working on another book, but this book, Surviving the United Nations. Bob, what is that book about?
It's about my first 4 years serving with the United Nations in West Africa, in Yemen, and in Baghdad in the wake of the 2003 invasion by the American Army. And it catalogs some of the best and some of the worst problems associated with working with the United Nations, meaning that on more than one occasion it almost killed me. And I am the only individual in UN history that I'm aware of that has been twice fired and twice promoted by the organization. That makes me just a little bit, maybe just a little bit unique. And being fired and being promoted by the UN over a period of almost 15 years makes for, I think, interesting reading.
Absolutely. Your account and your insight, more so than anything else, into military campaigns and history and the goings on of today is a very unique perspective that I encourage everyone to get your book and to read your numerous articles that you have published. So let's get started today. First of all, if you want to contact Bob, Robert_Adolph at yahoo.com. I'll flash that up a little bit later. But today we're going to be talking about your path through thoughtful responses and implementation of feedback. And Bob knows that I like to start with a scripture. It won't be a surprise to him. In Proverbs, it says, "He who separates himself seeks his own desire. He seeks and quarrels against with all wisdom." And so, Bob, when you see that and you think about responding to people and implementation of different ideas, implementation of strategies, and you couple it with this proverb, what are your thoughts?
From a leadership perspective, as a leader, the first phrase, the first two words that come to mind are active listening, as being the best descriptors of that parable, if you will. And it's one of the hardest things for good leaders to do. And it's one of the most essential, because if you ever hope to build good teams in complex circumstances with people that may or may not share your values, which is a big issue.
A big issue.
Yeah. Then you need to become an active listener. In other words, turn your responses off and actually listen to what is being said. And if you do, take the wisdom, look for the wisdom in what's being told to you. Now, this does two things. One, it demonstrates to the individual who's speaking to you a respect for their opinions. That's huge. If you win somebody's respect, what can follow behind that is their loyalty. If you have the respect and loyalty of your team, they will not permit you to fail.
So you said something interesting. All of it was interesting, but something really grabbed onto me where you talked about values, where you're talking with different people that have different values, and you also talked about opinions. In today's world, how do you separate? How does an individual handle when someone is putting forth an opinion and promoting it as a value? It may be that the two individuals talking have different values, but is every opinion a value?
Opinions can be representative of values. One of the problems with values is that they represent given wisdom. So you and I both grow up as Americans, and there are things that you can generally count on in most Americans that we are going to have shared values. And one of the things that I like to talk about in terms of shared values is an issue that everyone can get a grip on, and that is corruption.
All right.
So, for example, in the United Nations, when I was working in West Africa, I found out that from an African perspective, if you grew up in Africa, your idea of corruption and the American idea of corruption are two entirely different things. So, for example, to do the honorable thing in Africa requires you to first be loyal to self, family, village, and tribe. So if you are successful within whatever your career field is, you're expected to engage in nepotism and bring members of your family into the fold.
So let me ask you, is this why so many companies have trainings on when you're doing business internationally, and they specifically talk about Africa, where a bribe is acceptable, but in other countries it's not. Therefore, you should not be accepting bribes, even if when you're doing business in Africa, the only way you can get it done is to take a bribe or to offer a bribe.
When I talk about these, you've just hit on one of the Q&A sessions I had at several universities previously. And what we're talking about now is a hypothetical. And I'm going to take you to a hypothetical. So try and imagine for a moment that you're in charge of a United Nations convoy somewhere in Central Africa. And in that convoy are 10 trucks. And in each one of these trucks is a ton of foodstuffs. And your object is to get that 10 vehicle convoy to a refugee camp to feed thousands of starving people. You are stopped on the road by a warlord. He wants one of your trucks in order to allow you to pass.
As a toll.
Yes. Do you do it or not? I'm asking you.
You know, and it depends. I guess the answer is, from my perspective, if that is the way that business is done, and you are going to A, lose your life if you do not give up one of the trucks, and B, if all the rest of the trucks are going to make it to feed the people, better you should be able to feed all those people and only lose one of the trucks than have everybody in the convoy get killed and lose everything.
Well, even if you're dealing with a convoy, they're not going to kill you. Okay. The question is, do you give them a truck full of food? Okay, that's going to go to a rogue military organization that's going to do more harm later, and you're going to feed his soldiers in order to get to the refugee camp and feed the starving women and children? This is a question that one of the professors at one of the universities I spoke at looked at me and said, absolutely not. You don't violate your rules of engagement. You do the honorable thing, turn around and go home. And of course, that means everybody in a refugee camp starves.
Right.
Or you bend your honorable behavior to the circumstances and say something like, okay, give them the truck, let them have that stuff, but I want 9 to go feed those starving refugees. It's obviously situational ethics. It's obviously, it bends your morality.
Well, and it really leans into this point that when you do receive feedback, there's a delicate balance between how you respond and what you implement. Because if you've got the warlord standing there and he's like, hey, this is great, I want you to feed these people, but this is a toll road. You've got to make a decision. Thankfully, I have never found myself in a decision like that. And I would think that, in business, that could be considered a bribe. But when it's a matter of feeding people and otherwise they're going to starve, I don't know where that balance actually is. I don't know. Are my ethics flawed in your opinion?
No, this is the question. This was what, and it sparked a conversation or a discussion in the Q&A subsequently. Okay, what is the right thing to do when you're faced with impossible choices?
Mm-hmm.
You can either violate your code of conduct in order to have a better outcome. Okay, the greater good. That's often called the greater good. You do some evil in order to serve a greater good. And let me tell you, it happens in the United Nations every single day. So for 15 years, I was accosted by the differences in people's value systems.
All right.
Okay, so for example, if you go on the United Nations website and you look at the ethics office, it talks about the shared values of integrity, honesty, transparency. Well, I can assure you, there are several people in the working.
But they have different definitions of those words.
Their values are not shared at all. They're not.
Yeah.
And when that happens, you have guaranteed conflict. Guaranteed. So my 15 years with the United Nations as a civil staff member was often conflictual.
So when you find yourself in a situation where you're dealing with someone that is overzealous, overly self-confident, dare I say how I know I was in my younger days, and in the conversation we had before we went live today, it sounds like you may have been also. How do you deal with people like that without knocking the battery off their shoulder, to talk about the Robert Conrad commercial from years ago, without knocking them down, but still able to interact with them? How do you deal with them?
Probably the most important thing that's happened to me in my adult life, and I'm talking at the personal level, the emotional level, the psychological level, is at some point I managed to achieve some small degree of self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
When this happened, and I'm still very much a work in progress, I was able to do something I had never done, or I had always aimed at, but never successfully done before, and that is take my ego and what vanity I possess and put it in my pocket and leave it there. When you're able to see a circumstance, look around you at the people around you, and understand how you impact them. Because if you're the leader, and I've been in leadership positions for half a century, only near the end of that 50 years did I discover that much of what I was doing was simply wrong. It was wrong-headed. It was the difference between knowing the path and walking the path. I had written several articles about leadership over the years,
Mhm.
and all of them were fine. All of them were fine. But taking that information, that knowledge, and integrating it into your emotional self, integrating it into your personality, it was relatively easy to put it in one lobe of your brain where the rational part lives, and something else to integrate it into your personality. Much more difficult. And
Well,
I've
and,
noted that when you achieve that, when you
uh,
achieve that state of some degree of self-awareness, a lot of the anger, a lot of the ego, and a lot of the vanity takes the hindmost.
so it's, and I'm flashing my book up here again for a purpose. Before you and I went live today, we were talking about your next book, which I want you to talk about a little bit, because I think you've led us to that place. But writing, for me, was very insightful, because it made me realize why I believe what I believe, why I am the way I am. It had me learn and understand my own personal philosophy. When people ask me what my book is about, I talk about how it's my personal manifesto on personal growth, improvement, and leading other people. And I say it tongue in cheek, but it's my lifetime of experience, and you have almost 20 more years on, well, 15 more years on me. I'm not just 50. I'm 50, gosh, I'm 57 now. Yeah. So 13 years on me. Um, but to sit down and write and put the words down and think about what you actually believe, it sounds like what you were just talking about. Um, do you recommend that for people, and why?
Uh, you just hit on the topic of my whole book. And again, I want to give credit where credit is due. The Canadian public internet, the Canadian public intellectual, Jordan Peterson, said it first. Writing is the most rigorous form of thinking. And that struck a chord with me, and it got me thinking. And that is the germ, the genesis of my book. I was taking a look at that issue and saying, damn, he's really hit on something here. I've been writing and publishing since 1982. Every time I write an article and I have to conduct research and I have to
Mhm.
get it by an editor, and recognizing that maybe hundreds or thousands of people are going to read this article, I have to look at every single word and make sure that it's conveying what I hope it's conveying. And this process of having the germ of an idea, sitting down and writing it out, sending it to friends or editors and having them take a look at it, it really is the most rigorous form of thought. And in my estimation, it has made me better both personally and professionally. It served massive benefits in terms of my professional life, where writing is really a big deal. I wrote professional reports for 40 years.
Mhm.
In order to make a coherent argument, you have to be able to write well and you have to be able to think clearly.
Do you use anything like Grammarly when you're writing, to massage your thoughts into something even more coherent, not as a final product, but do you use any of the technology out there to help you through the writing process?
I'm nearly 71 years old, so I would easily characterize myself as a dinosaur. I am a technological dinosaur. The fact that I'm managing this process that you and I are in right now is amazing even to me still. Um, so although I'm familiar with Grammarly, okay, I've never used it. I've, as I said, I've been writing and publishing since 1982. So I've published over 200 articles. So in that time, I think maybe through osmosis, I've learned something.
Sure.
And And people keep on publishing me, so I must be doing something right.
Absolutely. So what you've had to say has been very insightful, and um, it seems as though so many people, when they find themselves in a business situation, and I'm sure you experienced this in the military too, you talk about active listening. Well, part of active listening is acknowledging what the other person has said. But I think too often people get into their own mindset of what they want to accomplish, and they just blow by what that person has said. What is your recommendation or strategy for an individual to truly embrace active listening, and how they respond to not only get their point across to the individual they're talking to, but to acknowledge what that person has said? How do you blend those two things?
Again, I think you start with a human, emotional, psychological start point. Okay, so you as the individual, you as the individual leader. And the most important thing, in my estimation, is that level of self awareness that I was talking about. Do you know how you impact others? It can be very severe if you're the leader. You're the leader. People pay attention to what you say. They may like you, they may not like you, they may be indifferent to you. But the fact is, whatever you say, whatever you do is going to have impact. And if you're self aware enough, if you're sufficiently self aware to understand that, you can modify your behavior to fit the circumstance that you find yourself in. So, back to active listening again. Always, every day, active listening is massively important to leadership, whatever leadership position you happen to be in. If you listen, actually listen, and then acknowledge what they're saying. So I always say things like, I hear you. I believe your point is valid. You're validating not only the person's opinion, but you're also validating the person emotionally. Remember, I think in a previous episode where you and I were talking, we were talking about things like emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That also is massively important. You can have, well, let me back up and say one other thing, because this is important. In order to be a good leader, you first must be a good person. I'm sorry, if you think that you can be a sociopath and still be a good leader, wrong. It
Wrong.
ain't happening. You can't. That's a bridge too far. First, you have to have some degree of empathy for other people. If you don't have some degree of empathy for other people, empathy is one of those characteristics that is absolutely key, critical in good leaders. If you don't have it, you're
How do
never
you
going to get
develop
there.
empathy? How do you develop empathy?
You know what? When I started out as a young sergeant in the military, I thought that leadership was all about being a hard ass.
Right. Because you
Okay?
don't seem like the most empathetic guy, but I bet there
No,
is empathy within you.
back to walking the path again. I spent a lot of time writing about leadership, and I mastered the academics of it. So I put it, like I said, on one lobe of my brain. But I wasn't very good at implementing it in my life because my ego and my vanity got in the way. And ego and vanity will always get in the way.
Always.
So if you can work toward that greater degree of self awareness, then you can learn to take your ego and your vanity, stick it in your pocket, leave it there, and only then can you actually do active listening, where you're not thinking about your retort. You're thinking about what the individual is saying and how it can be integrated, and subsequently acknowledging their contribution to the team effort. That's huge. Failure to do that is hurtful to the whole team. And something the leader needs to understand, one of the worst, I know it's a cliche, There's no I in team. There's perhaps another way to say it. Okay, the most important word is not I. Put that aside. The most important word is our. Remembering if the team leader remembers that he or she is also a team member,
Right.
You win. It's a win. You create win-win scenarios.
So I subscribe to that. You can be a leader. You are promoted into leadership after you have served on other teams and gained wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and someone has recognized it and given you authority to lead. Yes, there are situations where you need to grab leadership, but for the most part, people are promoted into leadership. But what I also subscribe to is that you cannot simply lead teams. You must always be part of a team where you are submitting to someone else's leadership. And it's best even if it's in a different situation than those situations where you find yourself as a leader. If you are a leader in an association, then you should be a submitted member in a different association. If you're a leader at work, then if a separate situation at work or in an association, you should be a submitted member. Do you agree with that? And do you think that's important?
I'm not sure I understand what a submitted member means. However, um, I often find, I'm not pointing the finger at you, I often find that people tend to complicate the hell out of leadership. It's
Right.
complicated enough, it's complicated enough in implementation, but the rational part of our minds, the academic in me, those things that back to rigorous thinking again and writing, there are only two parts to good leadership. And again, I think I talked about this in a previous episode too, but some things are worth repeating. There's only two components to good leadership. Caring, you have to care about your team, and that requires empathy. And if you care about your team and you have that degree of empathy, you can engender, you can earn the loyalty of your people.
So I think Eric can help me with what I'm trying to say here. I believe that yes, you can be the team leader, but while you're the team leader of one team, you need to be a team member
Yes,
of another team. And if you only find yourself in situations where you're the team leader, you are setting yourself up for failure if you are not also a team member of another team.
um, I'm a little bit confused about what another team means, but for me, I've been in the military and the United Nations. With
Okay.
those few exceptions where I was a deputy or an executive officer, I was always in charge. Literally, I've been in senior leadership positions for the overwhelming majority of my adult life, and they were formal leadership positions. I was the boss.
Were you always the boss? When you were the boss of a formal leadership situation, were you the boss in every single room you walked into, or were there rooms where someone else was the boss?
Sure, I was a security chief in the United Nations, so I was in charge of security, United Nations security, in every country I was in. However, okay, I often had to work with other agencies, funds, programs of the United Nations. And when I went to those agencies, funds, and programs, okay, of course, they had their own people who were in charge there. My narrow slice of the pie was security. And everyone who was in security in that country, at least by policy, was under my authority.
So, what do you think an individual learns by ensuring that when they are a team leader, they are a team member in another situation?
Well, I think that, again, goes back to self awareness. Um, I'm always a player, whatever table I was sitting at, I'm always a player. Okay, and I'm in charge of security-related matters. But there might
Right.
be 10 other people sitting at the table that are in charge of, from the World Food Program, from the WHO, from the World Health Organization, from FAO, from WFP, UNICEF. Each and every one of those, I have to play in their playground. So, if you will, I have to play nice. And particularly in the United Nations, and this is something we don't talk about very much in leadership, but the fact is, in the United Nations, it was essential. First, you had to be a good diplomat. Now, in the military, I never spent one day trying to be a good diplomat. I never spent one day trying to be a good politician. But in the United Nations, it was essential. And it's a tough racket. It's a tough racket because that means, again, you have to have a good measure of control on yourself, your ego, and your vanity. You're not the boss at that table. There are multiple bosses at that table, and you have to play nice with all of them.
And that is the point that I am getting to, that you cannot just be the chief.
No.
You have to be able to get along with others. So when you find yourself in a situation with those other individuals, and they are telling you something in a feedback situations where you do not necessarily like what they are saying, and you feel the hair rising on the back of your neck, you feel the internal engine starting to rev up, how do you respond?
I can give you the best example of that I've ever heard, and it happened to me. I was in Baghdad in 2003, and I was telling the United Nations in both New York and in Baghdad that we were extraordinarily vulnerable to attack. And I kept on saying it over and over and over again. I said it orally, I said it in writing, I said it in reports. I did everything I could humanly do to make the United Nations listen to me, to understand, to accept the fact that the circumstances in Baghdad were extraordinarily hazardous. I failed. I was a complete and utter failure. And then on the 19th of August in 2003, a jihadist suicide bomber in a flatbed truck with 2,000 pounds of explosives on the back hit our compound wall, breached it, and exploded himself and the 2,000 pounds of explosive. It killed 22 people and wounded another 150, to include my wife, and took most of my hearing, which is why I've been wearing hearing aids ever since. I failed at my job to convince those people in the United Nations that there was a verifiable threat. We got hit, and I was proven right. Finally, but 22 people had to die because of it. And that's I speak about that for quite a while in my book, and explain how that impacted me personally and how it impacted the people around me as well.
So when you consider this final verse, because I like to go to scripture for wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, the heart of the prudent gets knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. How do you apply that to your life?
I think actually that's a great fit. I've reversed the two, and I think in Proverbs, particularly because what we do with language, sometimes we put nouns before verbs, sometimes adjectives. Okay. The bottom line is, what I think that means is that what I attempt to do, and what I've always attempted to do, is to seek knowledge. But seeking knowledge in and of itself is sterile. Knowledge is 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, great. But it's, so what? What does that mean in terms of wisdom? Wisdom is the application of knowledge within a human context. And if you apply that knowledge within a human context and you do it right, that's wisdom. And the smartest people I know, the best leaders I know, are not ones that can spout knowledge all day long, but those ones that have taken the knowledge that they do possess, learn how to apply it within a human context, within teams, and then turn a team around and apply it in a much larger context, leading to success. And the success is not just the end state achieved, but also success for the entirety of the team, so that every single member of that team knows and understands, because of the wisdom of the leader, that they have made a major contribution to the group's success. Every single one of them know that. And those people go home every single night with a smile on their face and some degree of satisfaction, and go home and talk to their spouses and say, we did good work today. And they smile about it. If you're that kind of leader that can put that smile on people's face, you are a great leader.
Awesome. Everyone. Bob, thank you for joining us today, me today on Litvak Leadership Live. As always, you have tremendous insight, specifically into our topic, your path through thoughtful responses and implementation of feedback. Your background was tremendous for this topic. For people out there, if you want to get in touch with Bob, to engage with him, to have him speak to your group, he is available for speaking engagements. You can reach him at the email listed below. His book, again, is Surviving the United Nations. Just type that in at Amazon and you can get it in Kindle, hardcover, and paperback. And finally, everyone, don't forget Proverbs for Leadership. My book is available on January 10th. Go to proverbsforleadership.com for more information. Bob, last word is yours on listening to feedback, being thoughtful about it, and implementation. What say you?
One of the chapters in my book, the one I'm working on right now, talks to writing and leadership, how writing makes you a better leader. One of the qualities of a good leader is to be able to communicate, both orally and in writing. The two are mutually supportive. So, for example, if you're a good writer, you can become a good speaker. The one is massively beneficial to the other. And that's going to constitute a whole chapter, how writing makes you a better leader.
So everyone, go out and write. Let me tell you, it's made an impact in my life. It's made an impact in Bob's life, and it'll make an impact in your life. That's it for now. Have a safe and prosperous New Year's Eve celebration, and we'll see you next week.